Good afternoon. I'm Jana Martin, Chief Executive Officer of the American Insurance Trust, known to most of you simply as the Trust. We are delighted that you're able to join us virtually today for the second webinar in our special ABPP-ABEP webinar series titled Parenting Plan Evaluations, Guidelines and Best Practices. Today's webinar is being presented by Dr. Philip Stahl, who is a licensed psychologist based out of San Diego, California, though his work has taken him all over the country and world for over 30 years. Dr. Stahl is a practitioner, teacher, author, specializing in high conflict families of divorce. I am very privileged to have been able to hear Dr. Stahl speak many years ago, and I've always been guided greatly by his sage advice and his experience, so you're in for a real treat. He has served on numerous committees and task forces designed to improve the quality of work in his field. In addition, Dr. Stahl teaches judges, attorneys, psychologists, and other mental health professionals about issues affecting families and children. We are very fortunate to have him with us today. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Philip Stahl. Phil, we're really excited about having you. Can't wait to hear what you have to share with us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jana, and thank you to the Trust and the connection with ABAP for inviting me in today. We're going to talk about parenting plan evaluations, guidelines, and best practices when there are cases involving allegations of intimate partner violence. Research has shown for many, many years that upwards of 50% plus of families going through divorce have some level of allegations of inter-partner violence. And what we're going to talk about today is really the problems that people have evaluating these cases, what's easy to do and what's very challenging to do, and talk about this in various ways to think through this process. As we talk and as I go over this information, I'm going to focus on both the evaluation practices as well as research that we have to identify some of the issues in domestic violence and what we need to know about these things. Just as an aside about me, I've been very fortunate to teach judges at the National Judicial College for over 25 years. And since the year 2000, I've been teaching domestic violence for the psychological issues of domestic violence issues with different judges around the country. And we're going to focus on some of the things that I teach to the judges as well. In fact, I'm going to be doing that in the state of Maine in about 2 weeks, a week and a half or so. I'm going to be over there teaching some of these same issues. But we're going to focus more for what we can do as custody evaluators, parenting plan evaluators in this realm. Now, it's important to point out that the name change has gone from custody evaluations to parenting plan evaluations. And I'll be talking a little bit more about that as well. So one of the things I want to do is focus, first of all, on why we need a program like this. California has implemented rules of court in which evaluators need to take an initial 16 hours of training in domestic violence and annually an update of 4 hours every year since 1999. We still see evaluations where the focus might be on issues of domestic violence, but the evaluator doesn't even begin to address it whatsoever. Other states have similar rules, none quite as extensive as California, but to name a few, we've got Florida, Arizona, Colorado. All of these are things that are required for family parenting plan evaluators in all these jurisdictions. There's many that I'm mentioning. The other thing is domestic violence is a factor that courts have to consider in nearly all states in the United States, and it's a rebuttable presumption factor in about half the states. What I mean by rebuttable presumption factor is that the court has to, if they make a finding of domestic violence, there's a rebuttable presumption that the perpetrator of violence will not be able to get custody of some kind. So they won't have shared custody, they may have visitation, they won't have legal custody in decision making. And we're going to go through why this is relevant and why it's important for families and their safety as we go through these 2 hours. But for these reasons, it's very important for anyone performing parenting plan evaluations to have an understanding of what's involved when these kinds of problems come up. So let me just share with you recent quotes from a custody evaluator. This is in an article, and the article is in the handouts. Not going to talk about it in the training in this workshop as to where this evaluator is, but this is a very experienced evaluator. He's been doing custody evaluations since at least the early 2000s. And it's not the allegations that are made about the evaluator. These are things the evaluator said. I'm going to go through this very carefully. People often ask me, how can you tell if people are lying? That's where my own clinical experience comes in. I know what it looks like when somebody is telling me the truth. Now, right this moment, I see 222 participants in the room, and I would imagine nobody in that number is going to say, I know what it looks like when somebody is telling me the truth. We have really good research in the forensic world to say that who's telling the truth is very, very difficult to understand, and that no profession is better at it than any other profession. By the way, even though judges are the only ones to make the determination of credibility, and we as evaluators might have data to support that a parent is or is not a credible witness in the case, and this is true throughout forensic psychology, neither judges or psychologists are better than anybody else, or better than chance at figuring out who's lying. So that's the first of those quotes. The second one is, it ultimately didn't seem to be something that was germane to the issue of trying to figure out what was the safest and most appropriate parenting plan for the child. I made recommendations with the understanding that these were just allegations, just that, allegations. It's as if the person who said this discounted all of the things that the adolescent child had said, discounted things that the hospital report of her injuries said, discounted what mother said about it, didn't really discount what father said about it. But in that particular case, which was highlighted in the article, he basically concluded they were just allegations. I'm going to say very clearly that as a parenting plan evaluator, when I read a hospital report of injuries to a child, the child is an adolescent, and the child who credibly talks about how they occurred and what the father, in that case, did that caused it, they should be more than just allegations. And the trouble with keeping it at the allegations level is it's easy to just simply dismiss it. The third one is, he said, and I quote in the article, the Me Too movement informs us that, about 90% of all allegations are true or something around there. In my forensic work, that's completely flipped on its head. About 90% of the allegations I hear are false. That kind of thinking, that kind of belief going into an evaluation might, I say might because I hate to use the word always, but more than likely always will create a potential bias in which the evaluator starts with a presumption of falseness and might not look for data to counter that when it's that high. My forensic work, I start with the hypothesis that the allegations could be true, the allegations could be false, the allegations could be different than made, but partly true. Multiple hypotheses are what is the hallmark of forensic work. Parenting plan evaluations, of course, are forensic because they are being used by the courts to help determine a parenting plan in a child's best interests. So to start with that bias, a cognitive bias of about 90% of the allegations I hear are false, leads an evaluation in a way which will be unable to overcome that bias much of the time. So I don't just say that about that one evaluator, though. There's two research articles. In fact, I think there's two I gave you in the handouts. And there are three that have really focused on, and these were between 2010, 2015. And I've given you the citations in my references section. That looked at evaluators' recommendations when there are allegations of intimate partner violence. And this research looked at it not only with experienced evaluators, I used a lot of experienced evaluators and not just new evaluators. They looked at 465, this one study looked at 465 custody evaluators evaluating the association between the evaluators' beliefs, background, and knowledge in their custody and visitation recommendations involving IPV. Again, the beliefs might be something like 90% of the allegations are just that, allegations. They hypothesized that evaluators' belief in false allegations by the mother and recommendations that perpetrators have custody or unsupervised visits would be positively associated with the following four characteristics: being a male evaluator, believing in patriarchal norms, not knowing a survivor of intimate partner violence, and less knowledge of IPV. They also hypothesized that the evaluator's belief in false allegations by mothers would be related to their recommendation of having unsupervised or custody with the perpetrator. And results of the research supported most of the hypothesized relationships. And essentially that more often than not, the variance in custody visitation outcomes were about the beliefs of the evaluators being held before the evaluation was undertaken. So with that evaluator I just described before, whose own quotes were in that article, the challenge is those beliefs will lead to the recommendations in a case. The third article in this study by Davis et al. Focused on the issue described, and they looked at, in New York, at 70 actual case law files, and each one, domestic violence was identified. Both parties had attorneys. There was a child custody evaluation conducted, and similar to other studies, Davis and his colleagues found that evaluators' knowledge about domestic violence, especially their awareness of risk factors and application of a power and control model, were more closely associated with safe parenting plans than either the severity or the abuse through the thoroughness of their evaluations. In other words, that when evaluators really understood the process, they did a better job as compared with those who had prior beliefs about what kinds of issues IPV had. But all the studies show that the beliefs going into an evaluation were more strongly associated with outcomes than what is actually going on in the real life of the family. The allegation in the case that I mentioned with the psychologist at the beginning slide was that he had grabbed the 15-year-old by the back of the neck. She was wearing a chain around her neck, grabbed the neck and pulled on it, causing harm to her neck, the kind of harm that hospitals often see with ligature damage. But that didn't play into the outcome. What played into the outcome appears to have been this evaluator's belief about custody evaluations. The most common beliefs that they found in the research were that false allegations, parental alienation, friendly parenting provisions, and failure to protect are all beliefs about the victim parent / victim mother. They found it difficult to identify any beliefs at all about domestic violence related to perpetrators from their research. And again, I'm talking about a priori beliefs prior to starting evaluations or particular evaluations. And what they said in the quote in the articles was, in our experience, people do not think much or talk about the person who is actually responsible for abuse at all. Instead, their attention is persistently diverted away from the abuse, even though abuse itself might well be the central issue in the case. Going back to this first case, the state he is in has, like most states, have what's called a friendly parent provision, that parents are encouraged to support the relationship of the child with the other parent. There are allegations of parental alienation in nearly all cases in which there are allegations of domestic violence. I often say that, like physics, for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. So the action is, there's a claim about domestic violence, and the equal and opposite reaction is parental alienation. And sometimes even when there's a belief about a failure to protect, that it's the victim parent's fault if a child is harmed, rather than it's the abuser's fault that the child is harmed. So in all those ways, we keep the focus on the victim parent or the victim, meaning the child in this case, rather than the perpetrators who cause harm to the spouse or the children. Conclusions from the studies, and this comes out of Davis's final study. If, as the 3 recent studies seem to suggest, the evaluator's beliefs are associated with outcomes, and if, as we observe, many of those commonly held beliefs are negative beliefs about battered mothers, then it is no wonder that outcomes are so often disconnected from the real life experiences of battered mothers and their children. An alternative pathway to safer and more manageable outcomes is for family court professionals to resist the temptation to avert their gaze from the abuse and to look at it head on instead. That involves a process of systematically identifying abuse, understanding its context and implications, and accounting for it in parenting recommendations and decisions. In the case I referred to at the beginning, the evaluator recommended 50-50 parenting and recommended that that both parents share legal decision-making. It's not connected at all with the kind of abuse that occurred in that incident with the child. So What I'm going to focus on mostly for the next hour and a half is how to keep our gaze on the abuse while simultaneously holding multiple hypotheses and simultaneously doing our best to gather data that will help us understand the family as best we can. I want to emphasize as best we can, because it's not uncommon for a well-done evaluation that focuses on multiple hypotheses and considers all the data to have a difficult time reaching a conclusion about the dynamics of family violence, which may have been involved in that family. So I'm going to start with the necessary mindset and bring up the the Association of Family and Conciliation Courts. That's AFCC. Their guidelines for intimate partner violence, which was a supplement to then model standards of practice for child custody evaluation. And the intimate partner violence guidelines were established in 2016. A brief word about AFCC. Again, there's around 230 people now. I don't know how many of you all are members of AFCC, but AFCC is an interdisciplinary organization of judges, psychologists, other mental health evaluators, mediators, researchers, lawyers, focused on doing good work for the well-being of children and families. And they periodically provide guidelines for different kinds of work. The model standards that was referred to with this document were published in 2006. They were just a little bit ahead of the APA guidelines for child custody evaluations. And they just recently been renewed and published this year. And those are available on the AFCC website. That website, for those who want to look at it, is afccnet.org. I think that's going to be in the chat somewhere along the way. And what I want to highlight is APA is working toward revision of the APA guidelines, but they haven't finished it yet. I'm not quite sure why. The specialty guidelines revision hasn't happened quite yet. Same thing, I'm not sure quite why. The rumor is that they're waiting for the ethical principles to be revised, and they can't finalize the other child custody guidelines or the specialty guidelines for forensic psychologists until the ethical principles are revised. So that's the challenge where we are at this time. But the mindset that's described in these AFCC guidelines is where I want to focus on briefly. First principle, prioritize the safety and well-being of children and parents. Second, ensure an informed, fair, and accountable process. What that means is essentially collecting all the data around the alleged violence, explain how the information was analyzed and synthesized, and directly linking it to the recommendations. Apparently, in the case described above, there was no mention of those things when I just recommending a 50-50 plan. It's as if none of the allegations of domestic violence mattered. Focus on the family, not preconceived ideas about whether IPV exists. We have to, those three guiding principles are in the AFCC guidelines, and I'm going to add a fourth guiding principle. Start with a process of developing multiple hypotheses. Continue the process of multiple hypotheses and gathering data about all of them. Managing and controlling for all kinds of cognitive biases. And while this isn't a workshop on cognitive biases, we absolutely must be aware of anchoring, confirmatory bias, recency bias, primacy bias, and other such biases that generally have a risk of influencing the outcome of our work and even the process of our work. Because if I have a belief early on in the evaluation that the alienation allegation is more important than a domestic violence allegation, my questioning and data gathering will focus in that direction more so than if I maintain the multiple hypotheses throughout and try to prioritize the safety and well-being of children and parents. Part of that may be I conclude that in fact there are no credible elements of domestic violence, and I conclude that the safety and well-being of children and parents is prioritized by shared custody, but only after a thorough evaluation developed by the process of multiple hypotheses, gathering all those data and taking everything to explain and understand the family involved. So in a nutshell, what involves domestic violence? It involves all the things on your screen. And there will be times when I just jump from one slide to another and not talk about it in the interest of time. And I think all of you are capable of reading these slides on your own. But these behaviors may occur alone, combination, and in terms of all kinds of issues that are relevant, such as frequency, how often have they occurred, recency, severity, directionality, which parent toward which parent toward the child, that's the directionality, the pattern, I'll talk about patterns, intention, what's the purpose? What purpose does the domestic violence serve? What are the circumstances and what are the consequences? We want to pay attention to all 8 of these things as we're going through our understanding of the allegations in a particular family and what those allegations, if true, might mean. And if partly true, might mean. And if minimally true, what might mean. I'm involved as a consultant and expert witness in a case where the mom is making allegations of domestic violence against the father, and she says that he has abused the children hundreds of times. Now, I'm working with her attorneys, and I'll be an expert in that case on behalf of the mother, but I'm very clear that there was no evidence presented in any of her documents that would support her contention of hundreds of times. That's the frequency. But there is evidence supported, including by dad's own admission, of the recency and severity of some of the allegations against the children. So I think we need to differentiate between all of these kinds of issues. We need to pay attention to and differentiate all of these various issues. Again, safety first, before, during, and after an evaluation. I don't see parents together at the beginning of an evaluation. This is pre-COVID, because now almost everything is done on Zoom when there's allegations of domestic violence. Universal and ongoing screening, and I'll talk about screening a little later in the next hour. Bring in our own in-depth knowledge to the case. This is why our training is so important and why I am so honored that so many of you have chosen to be part of this workshop. To utilize a systematic approach in how we gather data, to mitigate for bias and manage bias, to recognize the challenges involved in investigating allegations, to strive to organize, summarize, and analyze our information that's collected, to determine potential implications, understand necessary conditions for co-parenting and making decisions together, planning for children together, as opposed to having one parent primarily the decision maker, or sharing parenting and parenting time. And that's going to be the framework for the rest of the program. Let me define briefly domestic violence. All of these behaviors you see outlined in front of you are potentially engaged in a definition of domestic violence. Multiple psychological factors, physical factors, sexual factors, and economic factors. Each one has within them, less intensity, less risk of harm, or on a continuum to great intensity and greater risk of harm. Somebody who once pushes their partner toward the end of separation out of a fit of frustration is very different than the much more serious kinds of things that you see further down the list of physical harm. Similarly, cursing at one another or demeaning one another, yelling at one another might not be too problematic. But stalking after separation, which has increased in the age of iPhones and other electronic devices, is significantly problematic. So again, we can look at things along a continuum. So let's talk about differentiation of domestic violence. And I'm going to focus on 3 primary areas. Those first of those areas, which is the most prevalent in divorcing families, is going to be what's called separation instigated violence. So what you're going to look for in those list of 8 things to pay attention to, frequency, recency, et cetera, is you're going to look for when has the violence occurred? And if no violence has occurred in the marriage or other settings prior to beginnings of separation, if neither parent reports coercive, controlling, or intimidating behaviors, if the violent action, the behavior, represents an atypical loss of self-control, I repeat, an atypical loss of self-control, if it's generally limited to 1 or 2 episodes, and if both men or women equally in the marriage are fundamentally engaged in those behaviors, it's likely to be what is known in the literature as separation instigated violence. And by the way, this differentiation I'm referring to is referenced in an article in 2008, this special issue on domestic violence in Family Court Review. And Family Court Review is the journal of the AFCC. And if you become a member, if you are a member, great. If you become a member, also great. And if you do, what you'll find is that you have access to all of the Family Court Review journals back to the beginning. One more thing for membership, or lack thereof, but of interest in AFCC, their annual conference is going to be in Los Angeles next year. It's the 60th anniversary annual conference. This is the kind of information you learn when you're part of AFCC. The next category is less frequent than separation instigated violence, but the more frequent of the problematic violence is situational couples violence, sometimes called common couples violence. And here you've got power, coercion, and control, again, are not central dynamics. In research studies across the board, they have generally found that men and women are equally likely to be perpetrated. And this is in research of national representative random samples in the US and in Canada. The conflict So imagine parents being in conflict, and then as their conflict escalates, it escalates into some form of physical or emotional violence. And what it's related to is not power and control, which the next section will be. It's related to poor management of emotions and conflict. And if it involves physical violence, the most common forms are the pushing, shoving, grabbing, where there's typically less harm caused to the victim. Injuries are not common. The violence is relatively well contained. And perhaps most importantly, the partners are generally not fearful of one another. I emphasize, they are generally not fearful of one another. The frequency of these things can be once a month, once a year, whatever. So there's a range of frequency. The escalation always is in the form of the conflict gets out of control, and when it does, neither party is good at being able to contain that conflict. Let me give you an example with separation instigated conflict. Somebody might throw a cell phone once near the end of the separation, pre-separation actions. That's it. Here, you might get things thrown periodically as things escalate. As they de-escalate quickly, people can kind of catch their breath, calm down. They do apologize. And in both groups, these people own their behavior. They are remorseful. They feel bad about having acted this way. And they have some empathy of the impact of the behavior, of the aggressive behavior, whether it's psychological aggression or physical aggression. They have some empathy for the impact of that behavior on the other parent, and most importantly, for child custody purposes, they have empathy for how it affects the children when the children have been exposed to this kind of violence. It decreases over time. It tends to decrease with age. If couples stay together long enough, by mid-30s typically, it decreases at that point. And after separation, just like with the first group, it stops after separation. You don't get the stalking. You don't get the continued threats that you get in the next group that I'm going to talk about. Again, mutuality. And a rarity is that it's male to female or female to male in that kind of directionality kind of thing. Now, when they just did these studies, they looked at more severe husband to wife violence or wife to husband violence, and they reported a small percentage, as you can see. But I kind of hypothesized that maybe these should have been categorized in the next group, but maybe not, because they're so infrequent and there's no power and control involved. So we don't really know, but the severity of violence is very, very limited in these cases, very small groups. But again, multiple hypotheses, we need to understand what's going on with that particular family. Maybe the most common behaviors are the cursing, the name calling, the yelling, frequency about jealousy as an issue, accusations of infidelity, but no isolation, no stalking, no controlling behavior, no coercive behaviors. When risks are a little bit higher, it's actually with the younger of these adults. So by the way, this research on situational couples violence is not in the context of divorce. It's in the context of community violence. And what they found was the teenagers are the most, and young adults are the most at risk for this kind of violence. And that's where there's more likely fear of a continuing fear of violence and a higher frequency of violence in that population. We're going to get to coercive control in a minute, but the basic differences for SIV, separation instigated violence, SCV, situational couples violence, from CCV, coercive control violence, is acknowledgement of the violence, not denial. The perpetrators, especially in SIV, are embarrassed and ashamed and bewildered by how they could have acted that way. The situational couples violence, it tends to be somewhat normalized by the partners, so they're not quite as embarrassed and ashamed, definitely not bewildered. And if the courts decide to put in protection orders, which is very rare in situational or separation instigated violence, potentially somewhat common in situational couples violence, these parents comply with protection orders. They stay away from one another. They have relatively peaceful exchanges. Again, there may be tension if they're in the same room at the same time, or at the house. Say that the exchange occurs in a park or at the door front or something like that. There's tension. There might be some, sadly, yelling and name calling. But by and large, these folks comply with protection orders. And that's very different than coercive control. The broad research of domestic violence, coercive control is the least likely type of violence. At the same time, when the family is involved in dynamics of coercive control, it's by far the most serious, the most risky, the most lethal, the most problematic form of domestic violence. Before I get to the slides on it, I'll just say that the research is fundamentally clear that the directionality is at a very high percentage, somewhere between 87 to 95%, depending on the study, in the directionality of male to female violence in heterosexual couples. Coercive control violence can occur in gay and lesbian relationships as well, but obviously you don't have that gender directionality. Another key ingredient is that the perpetrator denies, avoids, blames the violence. If they even acknowledge violence, they blame it on the victim and externalize all blame away from themselves. And almost always, if they acknowledge something, will minimize what has gone on. Third, unlike the first two groups, where the risk of harm rapidly or gradually decreases after separation, and the risk of harm is very, very low after separation. For the coercive controlling violence, the risk of harm increases around the time of separation and around the time of and further on into the separation. So some of you may know the group that I'm referring to here, he says facetiously. Even those who weren't alive when they were at their prime of their work. The song is Run for Your Life. I'd rather see you dead, little girl, than to be with another man. Think about that for a minute. When you're young and 16, you're not thinking of those lyrics. It's kind of a great song. When you're working with families of violence, with allegations of domestic violence, as I have for the last 20 plus years teaching this topic, those lyrics are incredibly powerful and meaningful. We can thank John Lennon for those wonderful lyrics and for that amazingly wonderful song, at the same time speaking to some things. The other song that will come to me in a minute, and the group that also highlights the stalking that sometimes go on after separation, divorce. Most of you can probably think of this, seeing as how there's 240 of you, it'll come to you faster than it will come to me. It's the police, and I just can't think of the name of the song, but all of you can probably. It might even show up in the chat. So this is what coercive control violence is. And when you talk about battering, when you talk about classic battering, the history of violence, the research on violence, that's what you're talking about here. Injuries are much more frequent and much more severe. Violence is more severe for half of the abuse victims after separation, as I said. And many of these parents have a likelihood of severe personality disorders, whether it be sociopathy, whether it be narcissism. It depends on the particular person we're looking at, but clearly the violence, when it's severe and chronic, there is likelihood of the perpetrator having such personality disorders. The emotional abuse isn't just at the mild end. Things that happen that are much more problematic include isolation from family and friends, checking up on the whereabouts of family, on the partner, contacting them at work constantly, monitoring phone calls, mail, what they've spent money on, all of that, all designed for one purpose and one purpose only: to maintain control and coerciveness toward the victim, toward the spouse. Let's keep going. Threats, but the threats are very pointed. Threats to harm the children, threats to harm pets, threats to harm not just the victim's friends, the victim's workplace. Again, designed to intimidate, designed to interfere with the healthy well-being of the partner and their independent psychological functioning, free from such threats and coercion. Frequent false accusations of sexual infidelity, often with their own sexual infidelity at the same time. Again, economically, the victim might not be given credit cards, might not have access to checks, are given an allowance. When you hear people talking about the spouse having an allowance, like you give to a 10-year-old learning to manage money, that's a huge red flag. And that the allowance given is only for funds for the food and the children's clothes, perhaps. It is never enough. So again, the victim is always in a state of anxiety about money in the family, and always in a state of anxiety about risk of being harmed or being yelled at or being blamed or being raped in the marriage or being forced to perform sexual acts they don't want to. All of those are big, big, big red flags. Here you've got a good dozen or more typical traits of batterers that comes from wonderful research by Bancroft and Silverman, initially written in the year 2002. And interestingly and sadly, most of these perpetrators were likely abused or witnessed or exposed to male-dominated abuse in their childhood. In the last 10 years, we've seen a huge growth in electronic stalking. There's wonderful research on this in Australia, which is where I first became aware of the research about it. But anecdotally, I've seen all of these kinds of things. Again, you can do your own poll within your own mind. This is the trouble with webinars instead of live, workshops where I can ask people to raise their hands and how many people. So think about this. How many people in the last year have purchased AirPods? Not AirPods, the air tracking system, to keep track of where your phone is, where your luggage is. I've got them for when I travel internationally, throw them in the suitcase. In case the suitcase is lost, we can keep track of all that, right? Wonderful device. They keep an eye on where that device is, right? But what about when the perpetrator of coercive control throws it in a child's backpack, and now they can keep track of where the child is, or maybe even throw it in the wife's purse, and they can keep track of where the wife is. You can do that stalking electronically through home appliances, through emails, through keystroke kinds of software, cameras, vehicle tracking, all kinds of things. Alexa, all that. Even drones can be used that way. I was traveling with a friend of mine in South Africa. He's from South Africa. He had a drone. We were playing with it. Our wives were sunning themselves at the pool of the hotel we were staying at. We were using the drone to see where they were and wave to them, and they could wave to us, all that kind of thing, right? My daughter looked at the picture and said, "Are you stalking her?" The joke is, no, of course not. But they, in fact, can be used for such stalking. So we need to be paying attention to all the different ways that electronic stalking can occur. I was involved in a case once as a consultant where the evaluator was unbothered by the fact that the father showed up at Whole Foods regularly when mother was there, despite the restraining order against him. And he said, "Well, I didn't know she was going to be there." And the mother said, "He's been stalking me. Of course he knew I was there," and described different ways why she believed that he was stalking her. The evaluator completely failed to explore that in any further depth other than mother mentioning it as the reason for it, and decided it was a coincidence, using the only data to support the coincidence of this is the father said it was a coincidence. Now, I don't know what happened. I don't know what's coincidence or stalking, but at least both need to be checked out when you're an evaluator in that situation. Let me mention in these next two charts the key similarities and differences between the three groups. History of power control dynamics, none of the first two, significant coercive control. Is it gender-driven? Equally, first groups, most likely male and heterosexual couples in the last group. Risk after separation, extremely low with the situational separation instigated violence, low in the situational couples violence, and gets lower over time. much higher in the coercive control, especially at the time of separation, and for many of these families, much higher even further and grows over time. Impact on children, low, medium, and high. Imagine about that. The likelihood of undermining the other parent's parenting. Very low or low in the first two groups, very high in coercive control. The coercive controlling parent blames the mother, says she's incompetent, tells the children this, tells the children they don't have to listen to her, and essentially encourages them to treat her as badly as he does. And whether or not you believe in some of the theories of Sigmund Freud, one of his that's most relevant here is identification with the aggressor. And these children sometimes identify with their perpetrator father and treat the mother just as hostilely as they did before. Whether there's a likelihood of needing supervised transitions, very low or moderate in the first two groups, very high in the coercive control. These parents should not be together in coercive control, regardless of how much time the perpetrator has in its parenting time. They should not be near with one another at transitions. Transitions should occur at school, go to school at the beginning of the day, leave school with the other parent at the end of the day. Perhaps at supervised transition centers where mom will drop a young child off who isn't in school at the center, leave, and then the father will pick up afterwards and then get the children and then return back the same way. Unfortunately, there have always been problems with these. Anything we try to put in place, there can be problems. If we just Google domestic violence deaths, you can see all kinds of articles about problems gone wrong. One of the most problematic was of a situation in Seattle, where there was a social worker, child welfare social worker, who would maintain supervision. She picked up the kids. She met the father near his house. They were always together in the house. She never left. Then she would leave with the children to go back. What harm could there be, right? One day at this visit, they walk toward the house and the house blows up. The father, the children, and the social worker are killed. There was a case in Australia. By the way, Australia doesn't have guns, so you get very, very few gun deaths. They do have guns, but they're much more regulated and much fewer in society. So very few gun deaths in these kinds of cases. But there was a case one day where a father, this is Melbourne, Australia, in the picture behind me. One day a father went over the bridge, crossing the river that you see in this picture, and a highway, and the bridge is over all of that. He stopped on the bridge, took his 4-year-old child, picked her up out of the car and threw her over the bridge. I mean, these things can occur regardless of how much you put in place to try to prevent them. And I don't say them to alarm you. I say them to inform you. Every week I get articles in the newspapers of similar domestic violence murders on a regular basis throughout the world. This is not just an American problem, although most of the ones with guns are an American problem. But this is a worldwide problem as we know it, at least in what we often refer to as the Western world of Europe, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, North America, South American countries, things like that. The children are at risk of further trauma after separation in these cases. You often have co-occurrence of mental health disorders, substance use disorders. But the problem is, if the evaluator gets overly focused on the co-occurrence, they may blame the violence on the disorder, the co-occurring disorder, rather than forcing the look at the violence itself. So yes, there may be an increased risk when there's substance abuse. But nonetheless, the violent behavior needs to be treated as much as or more than the substance use disorder. Because even when you treat the substance use disorder, there may still be violence. There often is. We can't use that as an excuse. You want interventions to be simultaneous interventions. You also often have poor parenting with perpetrators of domestic violence, coercive control violence. And you might want to have, or will want to have, co-occurring interventions for the substance use, for the domestic violence, for the parenting, etc. I've already described the kinds of defense mechanisms that are common, the denying, minimizing, and rationalizing, but also in the victims. You often get dissociative type behaviors that are typical for trauma victims. That you might have forgetting, which may be tied to substance use and may be tied to a neurological impairment or a psychological impairment. You might get splitting, all kinds of things that will interfere with a perpetrator's and sometimes the victim's acknowledgement and understanding of what those behaviors have been and the impact on others. Again, we don't want to just know what happened. I'll get back to that in a minute. I'll hold that thought. Again, CCV has many forms. You can go through all these slides on your own, but I just want to be a reminder of this. But it's really most devastating when several patterns are combined. Again, we need to understand all of these things that I just brought up on the screen. Ultimately, who lives in more fear? Oftentimes, the perpetrator will say, I'm afraid of her. But when you ask the questions, you get no evidence of anything he's afraid of. But yet when you ask the question of her, there's huge evidence of what she's afraid of. And sometimes the victim acts in self-defense to the violence of the perpetrator. And certainly you have seen that in well-publicized, sometimes in the media, sometimes even in movies, where the victim of domestic violence, years of domestic violence, has killed the spouse. And this is a reaction, a self-defense reaction to the violence of the other. The court system is only more recently beginning to see this as a reasonable defense in criminal matters for that murder. So I'm going to have a lot of slides about the history of what's important, the frequency, etc. So I want to just talk about being an evaluator in this situation before I get to the next slides. So you got an open mind. You have a willingness to develop and understand multiple hypotheses. You really understand the nature of the differentiation between SIV, SCV, and CCV. You really understand the powerful nature of the concerns of coercive control and the increasing risk after separation in those situations because of this workshop, readings you've done, and all your wonderful work over the years to learn this domestic violence. So, what do? The first thing I want you to think about is asking one fundamental question that has multiple parts, but one fundamental question that might even begin the process of beginning to understand more about the alleged domestic violence. Many of my questions often start with the phrase, help me understand. Because I like open-ended questions and I like to put it on me that I need to understand what's going on. But I put it on them that it's their job to help me understand. So as a custody evaluator, I might ask the following question or series of questions. Help me understand the first time you experienced the kinds of violence you're telling me about. And they give me their example, whatever it might be. By the way, I've done that after I've done some screening that we'll talk about. I've done that after they've begun to tell me their concerns. Now I'm getting more direct with my questions. The next part of that question is help me understand the most recent example. And I want them to tell me in as detailed as they can what that incident was, both the first one and now the more recent one. And then the question is, help me understand the most problematic or the worst example. And again, as much information as I can get. Not only is that important to begin the process of gathering those data around frequency, severity, blah, 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 directionality, etc. But it gives a framework for the differentiation. If the first, worst, and most problematic are all the same example, that's going to be very different than a 10-year example in terms of first and most recent. And if the most problematic has been more recent than past history, it's meaningful to me as well. So again, these are the kinds of very specific questions, and I'll have a few more as we go along in the rest of this 2 hours to help guide you in your process and guide you in your thinking about these kinds of cases. And it guarantees that you will have managed a systematic approach to your evaluation, all of which are very important. So I mentioned history is important. I want to highlight there may be absolutely no corroborating evidence, such as police reports, hospital records, neighbors knowing of things, therapy records. Maybe none of that. That the absence of such evidence doesn't mean the violence hasn't occurred. That doesn't mean the coercive control hasn't been a problem. What it might mean is it is so insidious and under the radar outside the family itself that no one has known about it. If, as you are talking about first, most recent, and worst incidents, as you begin to hear these kinds of examples, and they describe what might be considered mild behaviors. I always believed in asking, help me understand if any behaviors have been worse than you just described. What have you been most afraid of? If they begin to talk about, I've been afraid at times, tell me about that. And what else has caused you to be afraid? What has been the most fearful time for you? As we know, often the most robust predictor of violence is past behavior. Look for evidence of violence in other settings, as well as probation failures or failures to follow restraining orders. And note that there are no data that would suggest any kind of profile of a perpetrator or a victim from psychological testing. In fact, although I am a psychologist, and I know although many psychologists are very well versed in giving psychological tests to understand numerous things, and I'm neither for it or against it, but there has to be a relevance to it. And when we're in forensic setting, just note that there is no evidence that there are any psychological test data to predict future violence or to understand previous allegations of violence. Certainly not around credibility issues either when it comes to domestic violence. Been a lot of writing about that. There is greater risk of future violence when the previous violence has been long-term, no intervention, the perpetrator externalizes or denies blame and focuses on the victim. And there's lowered risk when they've got acknowledgement, guilt, and remorse. They understand and have empathy for the effect of the violence on the children and partner. And evidence that the abuse has served to maintain control in the relationship, and when there's a true motivation for change. Many courts, if they make a finding of coercive control, will institute an order for coercive control batterer's intervention of often between 24, 36, or 50 weeks, depending on the jurisdiction. These things in this slide are the most important ones taught in those kinds of interventions. Briefly, the research about those interventions is not good. No, I said that wrong. The research might be good, although some of the research is bad research, but the outcomes aren't good in a lot of these cases. But the ones where the outcome is more favorable to a lowered risk is when the perpetrator attends regularly the first 3 months of those intervention sessions, and then continues regularly after that. When they can have all of these things show up, and when they can tell you afterwards what they learned, because I sometimes do updates in these cases about risk. And one of the things I'm looking for is, have there been renewed behaviors, but also about what they have learned, their acknowledgement, their empathy, their recognition of the effect on the children and victim, how power and control was the issue, and what they've done to, why maybe they needed the power and control. Is it a jealous mind like John Lennon's song, Run for Your Life? Or is it something else, an anxious, overly dependent personality where I need to control you because I need to keep you with me? Whatever the motive was for that, motive or motives. You've got some slides on the characteristics of the victims. These are typical things. Many of them believe some of the myths of relationships, such as the male should control the family, or family unity is more important than what I'm going through. They accept responsibility for the batterer's actions. If only I had done X, the batterer wouldn't have done Y. They feel guilt, they feel terror, they feel anger. They're passive. And as I referred to earlier, they often have PTSD or other stress type reactions, often with psychosomatic concerns. They believe no one can help them. And partly because the batterer has often, frequently, and over time has told them that no one else will have them and no one else will believe them. And for many of these victims, the fear of being beaten is less strong than the fear of losing the things that mean the most to them. They're often considered four-letter words that keep these victims in relationships: fear, kids, cash, and harm. No one's going to believe them. The children will be hurt. They won't have the money for a place to live, etc. There's a study out of Oakland, California, where when they provided victims of domestic violence housing for 24 months free of charge and training for employment, these women could become fully independent. So oftentimes we need to look at other solutions for the victims. This is a chart by Leslie Drozd, William Austin, and Jay Flenz, 3 psychologists from across the country, that talk about the things to look at while you're assessing the allegations of IPV. And they really focus on what exactly the kinds of things I've talked about: the behavioral dimensions, the pattern, frequency, and severity, who instigates it, and what are the risk factors for it continuing. I know it's hard to read this on a slide, but we're just going to stay here for a moment to help you understand the nature of the importance of the multiple hypotheses and the systematic approach to looking at all of these things before reaching a conclusion about the violence in the particular family in front of you. I can't say that enough, and you might even hear it from me once or twice before the 2 hours is over. Maintaining multiple hypotheses throughout lets us avoid the risks of anchoring and confirmatory bias, and maintain a systematic approach to our inquiries that include all of these things until we no longer believe they matter or that they could be relevant, so that it's thorough. And I can only imagine that the psychologist identified in the very first slide, who made those quotes, doesn't care about any of this. He only believes in, it's almost never true. And the evaluators who are parts of the studies that they looked at, in the custody evaluators' attitudes about domestic violence and how that rendered their impact on their decision-making, didn't care about any of this. Their attitudes drove the process. So this kind of framework is critical to the systematic approach. Now, there are a few other things assessing lethality is critical in CCV cases when victims say, "I'm afraid of being killed." And maybe histrionics. And maybe what's occurred when a parent says, for example, hundreds of times he's abused the kids. It may be spot on concern and accuracy to the real risk the person fears, because there have been threats of homicide or suicide or killing the kids. The perpetrator has fantasies of this. There's an increase in depression at around the time of separation, and continuing depression and a worsening of depression during the few months next year, especially if his relationship with the children is completely cut off. When there's access to weapons, keep in mind we may not know what access there is. When there's continued obsessiveness, when the partner continues to have a mindset of keeping an eye and an ear and a focus on the victim, the centrality of that partner involved in my life. So if I'm the perpetrator, all that matters to me is what's going on with that victim. That's a risk factor for lethality. And then you throw in substance use, you throw in an increased escalation, you throw in an increase in hostage-taking behaviors that can be totally explosive. Florida has what they call a risk assessment tool that outlines all of these things. And you can ask and look for history and look for data to support the absence or presence of any of these red flags. Very, very important thing to do. I've mentioned screening along the way, and I'm mindful that we have about 25 more minutes till I'm going to be done, and I may be done even sooner, so we can go into the Q&A at that point. But I want to just talk about a couple of screening instruments over the last 10 years. The AFCC guidelines for these cases outlines, importantly, we need to be screening for violence and the risks of violence throughout our evaluations. There are two promising instruments that I'm going to describe. One I've got slides for, and that's the ODARA, and one I don't. I do have some slides, but I didn't put them in this because I didn't want to spend a lot of time with it, but feel free to email me and I can get you some information. Or in fact, I think you all know about this incredible site on the internet. It's called Google. Search for it yourself on the internet. It's called DOORS, D-O-O-R-S. It's a screening instrument for abusiveness developed in Australia. Jen McIntosh was one of the lead authors. There are others whose names escape me. One of the things you'll learn about me, if you haven't already, is I just don't remember names sometimes that well. They developed DOORS as a screening tool in all divorce cases, and it's an online screening tool that parents can take. It wasn't online at first, but parents can take it to look at different things. And it's wonderful because it screens for all kinds of issues, family violence only being one of them. I urge you to take a look at it. And then depending on the screening, initial screening, there's a next step screening where you look at more questions, if enough of the first batch were answered in the affirmative. And then you look at the next batch of questions. And then the third batch lead to potential outcomes for what report writers, which is what they're called in Australia for custody evaluators, might want to look at when they're doing their evaluations in families with allegations of domestic violence. Again, I have some slides, and maybe one of the things I can do on that is to actually email those few slides in a PDF to the trust, and because y'all they have access to all of your information, they can hopefully send that to you, unless Jana tells me, no, we can't do that. I'm hoping they can say, yeah, we can do that, no problem. Because I don't really want to get 235 emails. Please get this to me. But anyway, I want to talk about the ODARA, which is a more recent one. It's called the Ontario Domestic Assault Risk Assessment. It's been talked about at several times at recent AFCC meetings and programs on domestic violence and training with judges around the country. And basically what it is, it's a 1 or 0 item. You score each item 1 or 0, and whether or not there is prior domestic assault or non-domestic assault. And there's, like I said, the 6 and 10, 13 of these items. And then there's a scoring system with what has happened in the last 5 years. So that's very important. And I want to talk about the importance for 2 pieces. One of them that is a real risk to the ODARA itself, and another which is a real strength to the ODARA itself. The risk is that if it's within the last 5 years, you may be getting lumped in some separation instigated violence into what is most importantly coercive control violence. But the 13 items would minimize the likelihood of that. But that could happen. The strength of it, another risk of it, is you might be missing very important data from the previous 5 years in a marriage or in a co-parenting relationship that would give us a higher score if we looked at, for example, at the past 10 years in these kinds of things. But the strength of it is it's not confined to like the last year. It's not confined to just a few kinds of isolated incidents. It's how many and what is the score and what is the risk. And ultimately, your scores determine the potential risk for new assaults coming up. Make sense? Hope so. Now, sticking with that, and I'll do this briefly, sticking with that systematic approach that I focused on, I want to talk about what's in one of those 2008 articles, the PPPPP screening of domestic violence. And no, it's not a urinary tract infection. My only joke with domestic violence stuff, because none of this stuff is funny, but potency, pattern, primary perpetrator, parenting problems, and perspective of the child. I've already talked at length about the first 3, so I'm not going to go over it at all. But what are the parenting problems of the perpetrator? And this is again that wonderful book in 2002, focusing on domestic violence perpetrators. Parenting problems can include all of these things and more. The ones that are going to give you evidence of screening to look for more information about and potential risk factors are things such as boundary and role problems in the perpetrator, becoming overly permissive and overly rigid, so very inconsistent parenting, which we know is not good in terms of well-being of children. For parenting behaviors, we know that authoritative parenting is the healthiest style of parenting. And when parents are hugely inconsistent back and forth in their styles, and they become overly permissive one minute and overly rigid the next, imagine how the child feels like a ping pong ball emotionally, where they have to figure out, what am I supposed to do? How am I supposed to act? Just like the ping pong ball of the victim parent feels when this is going on. Derogatory attitudes about the other parent, raging, not just yelling, but raging, using the threat of the visits or parenting time as a weapon, rewarding the child for antagonizing the other parent. And most concerning to me, an intolerance of the child's symptoms of distress. That whatever the child is feeling, whatever the child experiences, whether it be distress because of the history of violence within the family, whether it's distress because of the difficulties of the divorce, whether it's distress related to parenting, or even, as we see in many children today, distress associated with special needs of the child. The parenting problems of a perpetrator is a total lack of understanding, empathy, and tolerance for that child's actions, behaviors, and distress. Huge red flag to coercive control, along with the rest of these. So that P, parenting problems, is critical to understand. How do we understand it? Three-part systematic approach. Talking to dad. Help me understand your parenting. What do you do when? Help me understand your awareness of your child's feelings. What are some indicators that you can describe that show how you recognize your child's feelings? I'm told that your child has a diagnosis of autism. Help me understand what that means. Help me understand what the other parent does or doesn't do to support your child's special needs. All of those things and more, because the other help me understands are going to be based on what you've already heard, help you determine where this parent fits. And just like the stupid infomercial at 3 a.m, if you're still watching TV instead of streaming, help me understand you're going to, but wait, there's more. You're going to do the same thing with the other parent. And then you're going to ask the child things such as, what does your dad do? What do your parents do to show that they understand when you're scared, when you're anxious, when you're happy, when you're sad? Who do you go to? Blah, 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 and multiple questions like that. So this helps understand parenting problems from a systematic approach with multiple hypotheses. The perspective of the child, and this is when we're getting to understand more about that. What are you afraid of? What do your parents do that make you afraid? You keep it a neutral question. And when the child tells you about, well, dad does blah, 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 mom does, or dad does this, dad does that, dad does this, I will then ask, help me understand what your mom does that make you afraid. Multiple hypotheses. And if there has been separation already, and the child is going back and forth between their homes, you're going to ask questions about understanding how that happens, how that moves smoothly, how it moves problematically, and why that is. Perspective of the child is very important. This is from a slide from Jan Johnston, who is a researcher for over 40 years on these kinds of problems, where we begin with the risks and priorities for safety. Priority 1 is the most safety, we protect them. Priority 5 is the least restrictive parent-child access plan, benefiting a child. And if you look at those 5 P's, you'll have more data to help us understand where we need to be very careful and restrict access to 50-50 and joint legal decision making. But if you haven't done all that, then it's just a bias in favor of that. You got a couple other slides about restricting and imposing and lifting restrictions, conditions for co-parenting. And I'm going to stop now because I see that there's many questions in the Q&A, and I think it's time for you to have your say and allow me to respond to that. Thank you very much. I'm going to stop sharing the screen. Well, no, I'll leave it open in case I want to go back to a slide.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much, Phil. I really appreciate this. You hit so many very important points, of course. I really like the way you frame the help me understand, because I do think that that's such a wonderful kind of transition, and it elicits responses rather than setting them up. So I think that was very helpful. And then I, of course, loved your idea about the process of developing and maintaining multiple hypotheses. That's critically important, as again, you well expressed. So you're right, we do have some questions. So let me throw some at you. Please address new highlights of the new AFCC guidelines. I don't know if we did refer people to AFCC. I don't know if you prefer for it just to be left that way, or if there's something in particular you want to call attention to.
Well, that's fine. Let me just address a few things. First of all, they bring back the domestic violence guidelines to say that now those are important to still consider in relation to the new guidelines for parenting plan evaluations. So they haven't changed anything in that regard. But what they've done is probably 3 or 4 main things that they've addressed. First of all, they're called guidelines instead of model standards. In 1992 was the first time they did it. And the hope of AFCC at that time was that they could encourage states to develop standards for what evaluators should do in these cases, in all cases, custody evaluations. And I'm the first to say, and I was on that original task force, that they were moderately useful. But no state ever adopted them as an official way of doing business.
Right.
Again, I was on the second task force that looked at the modifications of those, and out of continuity only, they kept the name model standards, recognizing that they were more guidelines than standards. Rule of Court 5.220, 5.225, for those of you, 5.230, for those of you that are in California, are standards that evaluators must pay attention to and must act upon in terms of not only their process for their evaluations, but their training and continuing education in custody evaluations and domestic violence, those are standards. So by changing the name to guidelines, they really reminded the readers, and all those readers will include the user, the evaluator, will include government agencies, will include judges, lawyers, consulting experts, whoever they might be, about the guidelines. And that makes them consistent with the forensic specialty guidelines, which sadly will expire if they don't get approved by the end of the year. The APA child custody evaluation guidelines, same thing, but they're aspirational. And then with that knowledge of aspiration, as opposed to a standard that we must hold to, they've taken all the words shall out of it, but encouraging people to do their best. And I describe it when I do workshops related to evaluations themselves, not in the context of domestic violence. So in any context, I'm reminded of what I learned from a lawyer or one of the programs I did at the American Bar Association. And she said to the audience of lawyers in her part of the talk, because we were talking about parenting plans and other kinds of things, she described in her talk, look, I probably had in 10 years, 600 clients of all stripes, all issues, all kinds of things to pay attention to. And I might get better each time, but that's what my experience is. But for this client, it's the only one that matters. For this client, it's the first time they're going through this divorce. Mm-hmm. Now, sometimes they change lawyers, and that's not quite true. But with that thinking in mind, I've done roughly 1,000 evaluations of different types, full comprehensive ones, brief focused ones, reevaluations, updated evaluations, all kinds of things like that. I hope to think two things. One, that the most recent evaluation I've completed is my best. Why? Because I take to heart all the stuff I've been teaching.
That's right.
I take to heart all the consulting and critiquing of other people's evaluations I've done over the last 20 years, so that I learn from that and maybe can improve my own evaluations. And it's funny, my wife knows what I do and how I do it, and the strong beliefs I hold. She's also the one who proofreads my evaluations. And there are evaluations where she looks at me and says, Phil, this makes no sense. Or Phil, what would you do if one of the people you're critiquing put this in their report? And you want somebody to help remind you that you want to be the best at your craft, not just the necessary at your craft. Right. A gentleman by the name of D.E. Kirkpatrick wrote an article in 2004 about the floor versus the ceiling of standards and guidelines. And I always want people to think that for the family I'm evaluating, it's critical that this be at the top of my game. Right. And what I found, sadly, in critiquing evaluations, that the two worst kind of evaluators are the newbies who just don't know well enough, and the gray hairs like me who've been doing this for 20, 30, 40 years and sadly don't seem to care enough to do the very best they can at each evaluation. So that kind of thinking is part of what the guy described in the guidelines, to to really look at each case uniquely on its own merits and do the best you can.
That's great.
I can't remember the other ones, and you've got some other questions,
Yeah,
so that would be the end of that
yeah.
answer.
Okay, thank you. So here's a really interesting and good one. Please address domestic violence implications when dealing with parents with cultural backgrounds where domestic violence is more acceptable, also in cultures where male dominance is the norm.
Great question. Actually, any of these are great questions, probably even including the ones we won't get to. So a couple of things. Obviously, the guidelines for the first time, by the way, the AFCC guidelines talk about the importance of culture and paying attention to issues of culture, language, other such issues. I'm doing the evaluation now that doesn't have such allegations, but it's with a family who are from Finland and Estonia. The two parents are from those two countries. They've lived in the United States for many years, raised their children for these years in the US. One parent wants to go back to Finland, the other parent doesn't. So it's a relocation evaluation. But culture is critical in understanding these cases. And the same is true in domestic violence cases.
Right.
So I think the first step is to understand the culture. And one of my questions is always to ask, help me understand your culture and where you came from for your first 30 years of life or 20 years of life, and how it's different in America that you found. I want them to talk about the differences or lack thereof. Because some people from a different culture are new and adopt American culture right away, and some still maintain strong cultural ties to their country or culture of origin. What we find is that second generation people from another culture tend to be more Americanized, but first generation tend to be more still holding on to a lot of cultural issues. So that's the first step in helping me understand those issues. And the great part of that question is, what do they hold on to between a male dominant culture from their culture's perspective versus their perspective from their new place where they are in the US. The second thing is, help me understand risks of harm. It all goes back to harm, right? Independent of male dominant culture, there's harm. And we need to understand harm. If it's just male dominance, but there's no physical and emotional harm, because part of male dominance, also the cultural, for many of these cultures, as I understand, across the globe that are different from westernized cultures, the ones I've worked with, have a similar culture for protection against harm in families, for values of love, for values of caring and loving caregiving. None of these cultures have a culture of harm, and including and encouraging harm. So I want to explore that a little bit with them. Same thing with parenting practices. And then take all that into account when writing my evaluation report, not only because I've shown the acknowledgement of the cultural issues, I put that in my report, but how they've influenced the outcome of my recommendations, and maybe confront some of these parents when there's been harm. How is that consistent with or different from typical values in your culture? I'm reminded as we talk about it, again, it was a relocation case from San Francisco area to London for this couple that was from India, but a part of India, Kashmir, that's been at war for the last 50 years. So then you got all kinds of issues of trauma, all kinds of issues of family values, all kinds of, not the political ones that we call family values in the States, but family values that these mom and dad hold dear. And they were both first generations that came over in about when they were 20, maybe a little younger for mom, other kinds of things. And it wasn't the male dominant aspect that was problematic to me at all. It was certain behaviors of parenting that were problematic for me.
Right.
So, and ultimately in my recommendations. And by the way, domestic violence was a minimal component of the allegations. It was really separation instigated type violence, I concluded. But the parenting practices were a little more problematic. But again, I asked them, you are in the US right now. Do you understand? I don't do this isn't about competency. Do you understand the differences in the law? Like you might in a competency evaluation, but do you understand why the court is concerned about these behaviors, even though it's culturally more normative? Blah, blah, blah. So those are the different kinds of questions I might ask. So again, thank you for that wonderful question.
We've got time, if we can do one really fast before I do the CE. How do you make recommendations if it comes down to he said, she said, with no corroborating evidence and the research on human lie detection is poor?
Again, another great question. So first of all, I wanted to, and I'll do this quickly as I can, I want to stress that the recommendations I make are often multiple recommendations in all kinds of cases. I also believe that I am not the one to make a finding of domestic violence. The evaluator should not do that. That's the court's job.
Yes.
So what I ultimately do is I present the data that support what I believe to be the most likely types of the differentiation, SIV, SCV, and CCV. And I say, if the court finds separation instigated violence or situational couple violence, it's usually between the last two, situational couples violence with low risk of increasing harm, here are my recommendations. And then I go how to protect against for the first 6 months, maybe even making reduce risk and moving forward that way. And parenting plan time and parenting decision-making time. If the court more likely finds that it's coercive control and the risks are X, Y, and Z, these are the recommendations I would make.
Yes.
So that it's recommendations recognizing my inability to have made a definitive decision. Now, sometimes I will say that all the data I can see suggests X, but it's the same time I recognize the court may get other evidence, different words. I use data, court uses evidence to find Y. And then again, I go into my multiple analysis of risks and benefits, depending on the finding, and then the different recommendations depending on the findings.